So the country I chose to present on was Venezuela and all the problems that they're going through right now. Some background on the history is that Venezuela is the very first country on South America. It's relatively large with a population of 23 million. It is the 41st largest country in the world and was colonized by Spain originally and then gained freedom back in 1811. And they primarily speak Spanish, and it's been like that since the Spanish conquerors came over. Okay, so Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and this came to fruition after oil prices included heavy crude oil. So since that's included, they now surpass Saudi Arabia and have the largest portions. But the one thing is that the highest oil production in Venezuela occurred in 1998, and this was right before Hugo Chavez was elected. And ever since then, it's been kind of a downturn. Until 1998, there is now a decrease in oil production. And you can see that the oil reserves far surpass the actual production that's been going on. And all of this can be tied to Hugo Chavez, who was elected back in 1999. He originally was a political figure and led a coup and a revolution to try and overthrow the government, which failed. And he was actually imprisoned for 2 years, which made him an icon. And after that, he kept rising in popularity until he came into the presidential office. But that popularity did not last too long, seeing as all the policies that he tried to put in place ended up not going through the way that people thought they would. He was very popular with the lower class at first, but then as time went on, they realized that he was definitely a hard socialist and was not going to be taking the actions that he was suggesting at first. And he remained in power until 2013 by what many believe to be rigged elections, although it was technically still a democracy. And he only came out of the presidential office after he got cancer and passed away. But his vice president at the time, Nicolas Maduro, was then put into office as the interim president. And Nicolas Maduro came into power when the oil business was already failing horribly after Chavez had fired over 19,000 employees. So Maduro came in when the economy was still having a very rough time. He is still the current president of Venezuela. He was elected in some very controversial elections that went on back in 2003. And before that, he served as a speaker for the National Assembly. He was the vice president for Hugo Chavez. And after his election, there was a massive upset because the population of Venezuela did not believe that he had fairly won the election. So his opponent, as well as the public, called for a recount, which was overridden, and he was sworn in no more than 3 days later. So as Maduro, since he was the vice president of Chavez, he shared the same ideals. That's why he was chosen for that position. So Chavismo was ideal to try and bring Venezuela to its glory, per se, but that never went through. He encouraged social support programs, but most of them failed. And ever since then, the country's been going into an even deeper state of decay. And then he was reelected with an 86% of the votes in May of this year, which caused even more upset than the first time he was elected. So even the US Secretary of State was against the reelection, and it was largely agreed that it was not a fair vote. Then after his reelection, he actually went through with blocking most of the social media coverage on Venezuela just to have more privacy as far as what actions he was taking and what was actually going on in the country. And it wasn't until 2014 that he went ahead and reinstated that. So in this video is embedded. I also have the link in the resources below, but it basically just explains where Venezuela was at the peak of its economy when it started producing oil and became one of the richest countries in South America, and then the slow decay that happened after Hugo Chavez came into presidency, and everything that's happened since then, and the big uprise from the lower population as well that was very upset that all the plans did not come into fruition, and the country has just been going more and more into debt. Okay, so I just wanted to define an economic crisis before explaining exactly what is going on in Venezuela right now. But an economic crisis, dictionary definition, is when a country's economy faces a rapid decline due to a financial crisis, which is synonymous with a recession. And it can be more severe than that. It's really a case-to-case basis. But for Venezuela specifically, the outcome is inflation followed by deflation, and it turns into a nasty cycle of prices changing and declining gross domestic product. So this just indicates that the standard of living in Venezuela is rapidly falling, along with the value of the bolivar, which is the Venezuelan currency. So the hyperinflation going on in Venezuela right now is very severe. Right now, it's expected to hit over 1,000,000% inflation by the end of this year. It increased from 25,000 to 40,000% in a 30-day span, and after that, even doubled in July of this year in 2018. So efforts to calm the falling economy have been unsuccessfully made. The minimum wage has been raised, but that basically just led to a bunch of workers being let go because employers could not afford to support that many employees at the new minimum wage that was set. And just to give you an idea, 18,000 bolivares is the minimum wage, and that equates to about $2.50 US. So with this rate of inflation, that has affected prices with everything, which led to a lot of food shortages. And all of this started before the hyperinflation, at least to the rate that it is right now. But Chavez tried to avoid, well, when he was in the presidential office, he tried to avoid having the lower class be so critical of his policies. So he set a cap to critical products like flour, rice, and other basic things that people need to live. But this resulted in these products not being profitable for any of the companies producing them. So production fell, leading to food shortages. I know my family that's there right now says they'll get to the grocery store and the shelves will be largely empty. There are certain days of the week when they're allowed to go grocery shopping, and there's a ration on how much food you're allowed to buy per grocery store visit. So this inflation has made nutritious foods increasingly hard to attain, and not only foods, but just basic things like soap, chicken, rice, any home products, cleaning products, shampoos. A single roll of toilet paper is worth 2.6 million bolivares right now, which is, I think, about like 10 times more than minimum wage, just to give you guys an idea of how bad it is. And not only with food and any grocery supplies, this is also happening in a lot of the hospitals. There's a shortage of medicine as far as medications, prescriptions, and any treatments for very severe illnesses. For any cancer treatments, there's a 90% shortage. And there's been a lot of deaths recently just due to the lack of medical that's available. So there's been a rise in cost for medical care, and Maduro has refused any help from other countries. There have even been countries who have tried to ship supplies, humanitarian aid to Venezuela, and he blocks them off and sends them back to where they came from. He is dead set on trying to solve this problem himself, and it's leading to way more deaths and fatalities than we really need. There's been a 30% increase in infant mortality. The rates of malaria have been running rampant due to the shortage of vaccinations, and even healthcare professionals have been fleeing the country because of the inflation rates, which is leading to a shortage not only in supplies, but the staffing that they need to get treatment. And other shortages are also due to power outages. Maduro blames it on the planet getting too close to the sun, but it is common knowledge that the power outages have been happening due to power plants not undergoing regular maintenance, and they do not have the accessibility to the spare parts that they need to keep everything up and running. And this has resulted in 6 of the Western states getting power rationing, and anything past that, their power gets shut off. And outside of those Western states, the country as a whole has been experiencing power outages hours a day. In this year, 2018, it has been worse. In 2017, I know it was happening at least once a day. And that also affects the public transit systems as far as the metro not working, businesses that require power are not able to function on a daily basis due to this. This also affects hospitals and their ability to treat patients without any backup power. So all of these factors, the inflation, the food shortages that's followed, the lack of medical attention has led to many people leaving the country. By many people, I mean over 2 million citizens. So 7% of the population have left the country since Maduro came into power. So most of the migrants are ages 20 to 49. The working class is trying to get their families out of there. The big trend that's seen is the men leaving first and trying to establish a life outside of Venezuela and then bringing their families. So most report wanting to stay in Latin American countries, mostly because a lot of them are the lower class now that are migrating and they do not have the education to back up another language like moving here to the US or anywhere outside of Latin America. And this graphic just shows exactly where Venezuelans are going around. So the most of them have gone to Colombia. There's some in Peru. A large portion have come to the US. There's also some who have gone back to Spain. Not many true Venezuelans have gone back to Spain. It's more so the people who immigrated to Spain, well, from Spain to Venezuela first, to have a better opportunity to build a life, and then Venezuela ended up going downhill, so they decided to go back. But all of this migration has also caused problems for other countries since they were not expecting such a large influx of Venezuelan citizens to be leaving the country. So I know, for instance, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil have had major conflicts with people crossing the border. Borders have been tightened up with security. They're sending extra troops. There's now higher security measures taken. You are first allowed to go just with your Venezuelan ID. At this point, you have to have a Venezuelan issued passport, which is increasingly difficult to get since many of the embassies and government offices have been shut down. And there's a black market for those, which is running rampant with prices that a lot of the people that want to migrate really cannot afford at this time. And Colombia is already dealing with high unemployment rates for their own citizens, much less having to deal with people coming into the country. But there was a time about a decade ago where Venezuela took in a lot of Colombians during the civil conflict that was going on in Colombia. So they are trying their best to return the favor, but that still does not stop the upset of the Colombian population over all the amount of Venezuelans that are coming in and taking their jobs, and the ones who are still unemployed, occupying their streets. So Latin American countries have come together to try and brainstorm what's going to happen to the country after the end of Maduro's rule. So they have estimated that about a $60 billion loan will be needed to restore Venezuela to some sort of stability, but they're not sure when or if Maduro will come out of power at any point soon. So at this point, it's just hypothesizing. At the moment, Maduro himself claims to have plans to bring Venezuela out of the predicament it finds itself in. He just, when was that, in August of 2018, knocked 5 zeros off of the Bolivar, and that's when he also raised the minimum wage, which is counterintuitive since at the same time it left a lot of people unemployed. And he started a new version of the Bolivar, the sovereign Bolivar, that is now backed by cryptocurrency, which is linked to Venezuela's oil reserves. But this was done in the past and was a failure. So there are many people who are still skeptical about this, seeing as it didn't work out in the past. So why would it work now, especially when Venezuela's oil industry is going downhill fast? And many critics say that this overlooks the Bolivar printing shortage that's already being encountered, seeing as the government is running out of ways to print the paper, and there hasn't been any new circulation of Bolivares. So the inflation is still on the rise. Since the Bolivar is backed by the cryptocurrency, it hasn't slowed down from the rate it was at right before this was happening. So it's still on track to hit over 1,000,000% inflation by the end of this year. And that caused a bunch of confusion among store owners and any businesses as far as what they had to charge their customers and what they were going to be charged to be able to support their businesses. A lot of them went out of business as soon as this change took effect, simply because they could not afford the change. So hopefully moving forward, Venezuela will have better luck and Maduro's policies will be effective, but for now,